The Southern Alps in the South Island of New Zealand, running 450 kilometers north to south and containing over 3,000 glaciers larger than a hectare. The snow and the ice remain year-round on the highest peaks. Long before the high country sheep farming, the indigenous people, the first people, the Waitaha, periodically ventured into the area hunting moa, wika, and other birds, exploiting rock resources and felling totara for ocean-going waka. On the eastern edge of the Alps lies the Mackenzie Basin, extending 100 kilometers south to north and 40 kilometers east to west, the largest of its kind in New Zealand. At the foothills, the township of Twizel, built in 1968 to house a temporary workforce of 1,600, building the final stages of the Upper Waitaki Hydro Development Scheme, a 15-year project creating 37 miles of canal, 4 power stations, whose combined power annually generate 30% of the hydroelectricity of New Zealand. Having completed the hydro development, Twizel was to be removed, though a small group of passionate residents fought to retain the town and won. Twizel is now the gateway to Aoraki National Park, the control center for South Island's hydro generation, a focal point for the area's farming community, and home to New Zealand's finest rowing venue. This is a brief history of Twizel.
In the past, 500-600 years ago, people used to go into the Mackenzie country quite often, hunting birds. There were no large permanent campsites there that we could find, so we assumed that they went into the Mackenzie country, hunted, and then took what they found back down to the big moa hunter site. Some people have said that the Mackenzie country was always pretty open, barren, no sign of forestation, but I don't believe that is correct. In the ground there are still bits of charcoal that you can find, and these can be radiocarbon dated, and to indicate that, they can be identified as the species as well as dated, so we have evidence, direct evidence, that there was forest in that area at one time.
So you can imagine a party away for 3 months, hunting birds, doing the killing and cooking and packing. So they had various areas, and they always stored them on the side of the Waitaki, and they do it on any river. So they had their warehouses all the way up the river, and once they finished their hunting, then they'd make the morkahis, raft type, and they'd come back and load them up and sail them back down to the mouth of the Waitaki River, or where it may be, where the main kaik was, and that was their winter food.
In the forest lived various kinds of birds, forest birds like wekas and moas. A lot of people think of moas as being birds of the open land, but no, they're actually browsers. They needed some forest vegetation. And we found that people had gone into the area, into the Mackenzie country, and they had hunted these birds. They would camp overnight in a rock shelter if one was available, a natural rock formation. If one wasn't, then they'd camp out in the open. And behind them they would leave evidence that they had been there. Often, only thing that was remained were burnt stones from hangi type cooking. Very often there was some of the stone artefacts that they had used. In particular were a kind of flake knife, like this one here, made of a material called orthoquartzite. Orthoquartzite occurs in several places in the Mackenzie country, mainly around Greys Hills. And they flaked the stone. A great deal of skill was required even to make a thing like this. Flaked the shape, and then the edge is sharpened by taking little pieces off the broken edge, and it gives you a very sharp, rough cutting implement. That is used for butchering, like that, and it was used in mower hunting times for butchering mowers.
The winters here are more beautiful than the summers. The snow reaches the foot of Mount Cook, and the reflections in Lake Pukeki is heaven sent. Evelyn Hoskin. In the 1880s, the Pukeki Hotel was located at the banks of the Pukeki River, where the river meets the lake. It was the center for the early run holders of the area for mail, basic supplies, and the occasional meal. The farmers here endured isolation, severe weather, unstable wool prices, and a growing rabbit population. Rabbits were introduced into New Zealand in the 1830s for food and sport. 50 years later, the rabbit had spread to all parts of Otago, Southland, and had begun to invade Canterbury. By the 1890s, they had overrun the Mackenzie country, forcing some farmers to walk off their land. The New Zealand economy of the day was based on sheep farming, and the trade was dominated by South Island farmers.
Father took the place over. He managed it from 1897 until 1901. Yeah, well, he came here, and after the 1895 snow, they lost 15,000 sheep in the snow, and they almost went broke. And it was an uncle of my father that owned it, and he employed Father to come and look after the place. And £40 a year and 10% of the profit. And then I took it over in 1947. So, it was damn near 50 years that he had it. When I started in 47, I was only 18, and the manager left, and Father said to me, he said, you can manage it. He said, I came here, he said, at 18 too. He said, so that was it. I put on 8 rabbiters. They're trapped in the summer and poisoned in the winter. In the summertime, we used to give them $1 a tail. In the wintertime, they sold the skins, and a lot of them made a lot of money. And those old rabbiters turned around and bought farms. Well, rabbits went from around about 6 or 7 shillings a piece, and they were getting kills of 1,000 or 2,000 rabbits in a kill, in a poison kill. And that was with carrots. They used to turn around and just cut the carrot with a knife. A tin of mixed up poison, icing sugar and strychnine, and then turn around and cut the carrot and then paint it onto cut it, and then just cut the carrot out and feed it out. And the next morning they'd go and pick up the dead rabbits.
first properties were obviously taken up in 1856. The next few years after that, 1857, 1858, most of the other properties, their runs were taken up, the leases were. They were 1-year leases, and that nothing changed right through to the release runs in 1911, where they changed the boundaries, and mostly done in Wellington. And then the soldiery settlement blocks were taken out in 1920, really, just after the First World War. Well, certainly Ben O'Howe at that stage was split up into 4. And really the carrot they used at that stage was that you had no security over your tenure. And therefore it was a carrot in the fact that you could get 100 acres around your homestead, which was freehold, and have a 33-year lease at that stage. And that was done through what they call small grazing runs. That's prior to the Pastoral Land Act, which was in 1948. So that was probably the carrot that got people, splitting the runs up. And the property had come back from 84,000 acres and released the runs to 64, split up again into 4 properties around about 15 to 16,000 acres. So that's when Ben Rose, Omaha, Ruatanipa was split off the original Ben O'Howe run. And it was interesting to note that the soldiers all came home. Some of the properties were all named by the original owners, and it was those properties really they changed dramatically, probably with the invent after the Second World War, really, because it was the invent of bulldozers and aeroplanes and everything. Just made those properties so much easier to run. Up until that stage, it was pretty much cart and horse, and initially, tractors came in about 1936, but they were pretty small, and they did make a little bit of oats and things to feed your stock during the winter, which was always so very difficult to get through.
In 1947, controls were put on the Pukeki River to raise the lake 9 meters to increase storage capacity. In 1976, it was raised again, this time 32 meters.
The hydro camp was going when I first went there, and it was a strange life for me because I had never been in a hotel, because I'd never been encouraged to go into a hotel, let alone run one. I found that customers from the Ministry of Works were really great sorts, and we got to know them well. And our staff became good friends, and we kept some of them for years, and that was good. And we met a lot of locals, of course, because it was as the hydro phased out after building the first dam. The hotel was the centre for the district, really, and my husband was a good host. And he used to, have something very suitable to say to each person as he got to know them, and it really was a great life, a busy time.
I remember the first sort of people coming in to do surveys for this hydro project, and it was sort of something way in the future, and it wasn't really just considered. It seemed to be too far away to think about. And them telling my dad that they were going to take the hill away from behind our house, and it protected our house from the northwest, and I think he was pretty incredulous. I didn't hardly believe that, and over time you started realising just how big this scheme was going to be, because the machinery, it's actually hard to imagine just how much machinery was there. The noise was amazing. The house that was built about 1903 here, and it constantly rattled, and all the crockery on the shelves, everything.
A lot of people who were older than we were quite apprehensive about Twizel coming, because it was going to be a town of 6,000 people, strangers, and they were really apprehensive about it. But for us, we had children and they had to go to school, and I played a lot of sports, so I played tennis and badminton and squash. So I was involved with Twizel from the day one.
Then when Twizel moved in, that was all changed around. There was all of a sudden a great influx of people going in all directions, from an isolated community of, 50 or 60 people and staff on the runs, up to 6,000, built up to 6,000 over about 5 or 6 years later. So that was a big, huge social change to get used to for the people who had farmed from the generations of Roseanne's father and the Jack Cameron's father, and then Jack himself would know.
We were apprehensive because of we weren't sure how high Lake Ohau, because our farm had quite a big lake frontage. We weren't sure how high the lake was going to be risen and how much ground we could lose.
Once it was muted, well, we could see that by raising Lake Pukaki, it affected only 5 different run holders, and there was a very loud voice, against it. As it turned out, it's been great for New Zealand, but a lot of us have paid quite a bit for the power.
We were unfortunate to be right in the line of where this canal and everything had to go through. We lost over 1,000 acres, but that was just the way it was. But looking back, it was really worthwhile, because with putting all that up, the roads were all improved. Those before they came up there, to come from Timaru to here was about a 4 or 5 hour drive. And we finished up with it's only an hour and a half. You can't do it now in an hour and a half, because there's too many damn cops here.
He went around most of the South Island, and I think the North Island too, and pointed out where hydroelectric schemes could be built. And it was quite an achievement, that trip, because, even the roads around the country weren't very good in 1905, but old P.S. Hay, he got around the country and he picked the Manapuri scheme, such as it's been built. And he certainly knew about the Waitaki, and I think he knew about the Waikato in the North Island as well. So he did a pretty good job. I don't say it was all what he recommended was all followed exactly, but he certainly showed the potential of the areas. Town was designed for about 15 or 1,600 people, and we had about 1,600 houses, and of course running the town of Twizel was just one more part of our job, because we owned all the houses and had to maintain them and settle all the squabbles and that sort of thing that come with these sort of things. It used to be a convoy of 6 houses at a time coming up the road from Oamaru and Otamatata to Twizel. We were building 1 house per day at Otamatata when we were doing Twizel.
8 years to build the town. There was a skeleton crew working on the town all the time, There was houses coming in all the time and roads getting built, and, they'd done a street at a time basically, and set it up with the houses, and then they'd move on to another one, and single camp, and there was so much to do,
But certainly Twizel was about the biggest job of its kind in the world at its time, but mainly on the scale of the machinery and so on. It took us 4 years to build the Ben More Dam with 16 million cubic metres of dirt, and we were shifting that quantity in 4 months at one stage in the Ohau canals. So it was a major job of earth moving and concrete.
One night when I wasn't working on shift, to go out to the Tekapo Canal and see by one of the contract foremen and just show me what was happening out there. And there was nothing to come to one of the camps there and see 60 scrapers in a row, one behind the other, and then you'd travel on to the next camp and you'd see the same thing.
There was a general overall efficiency about the whole thing. You never went around and saw, stuff that wasn't working. The earth moving gear was always out there doing something. It was running around the clock. This project was basically run right around the clock, and it had a vibrancy and an urgency to it. Right throughout the year, and everybody looked forward to that end of year break where the whole thing shut down. So. When you look back over it, it is a massive earthworks undertaking, absolutely massive. And if you tried to undertake that sort of thing today, you would wonder what the value of it would be in dollar terms and whether anyone would be brave enough to actually do it.
An important part of the construction maintenance side of things up there was the fabrication, welding and fabrication workshops and the machine shop. There was not very often that they couldn't actually manufacture what was required for the project. We built all the straddle carriers for carrying the penstocks, as well as we had a penstock factory which built all the penstocks as well. Imported special plate rollers to actually form the plate to form the penstock. The machine shop was managed by Arthur Middlebrook. He was quite a legend in the time, and he never turned down a challenge to build something, and Arthur and his team in that workshop there actually built a lot of special items that people outside of the project were in awe of.
He was a carpenter by trade, so wonderful casing that they did. Amazing stuff. Absolutely amazing. Yeah, but I didn't see a lot of that. You didn't see a lot of that because you just knew that they worked down there and everything they made went on to the job as casing or whatever. But when I got the pictures to put into my book, I thought, wow, that's what he was involved with. Yeah.
In the carpenter shop, you built the formwork. When you went out on site, you placed it, so you got an idea of what you had built, what it was going to be used for. You had to shape every piece of 2x1 or 3x1 into a shape, and then bend it round until you went from the round to the square. And we spent the whole year building 2 pieces of formwork, 2 draft tubes. After it was all finished, you sanded, and then little gaps you filled with Bonderfill. Every piece was put in, was shaped, put in, glued and nailed, and then you'd get another bit, and you'd go again, shape it. No, it had to be perfect, because otherwise with concrete, if you get an imperfection, the water will eat it out if there's any imperfections in the concrete. So everything had to be perfect. But to the point that everything was sanded and filled time and time again. Each one of them, there was enough timber for 6 houses. And when after the pours was done, they just got in with chainsaws, just cut the whole thing up. That was the end of it. It was cold in the winter, but yes, no, it was very interesting because a lot of this formwork I built, and then I got to put it into place. And I started off at OOA on the foundations, and I finished up putting the roof on the first quarter of it. So I went from the bottom right to the top. In those days you didn't have any harnesses and you walk around on the purlins up 100 feet with no protection if you fell. But it was, well, you didn't fall because it would hurt.
Yes, I worked at the Johnson batching plant for a couple of years on shift work, maintaining the plant and the trucks there. The batch has got quite a history. It came from Pearl Harbor over to New Zealand, and it had done a lot of the construction concrete for the hydro dams on the Aoraki River, and then into Twizel. So it was pushed to the limit a lot of the times to keep up with the concrete pours that were going on, but a great place to work, and it produced a constant flow of good quality concrete up there.
They did everything in slabs. They'd box it up one big area and pour that, and then they'd green cut all the concrete, and so that the next one bound to it properly, and then you'd do another pour over the top. And I mean, the Clyde Dam was done exactly the same way, but yeah. Probably because I had a young family, I didn't spend anywhere near enough time with them, because we were working some horrendous shifts down here. I mean, it was nothing to do 15-hour days. And in this day and age, especially driving, there's no way you'd be allowed to do it, but back then we did. And by the time you went home and had to sleep, you had to sleep in the feed and the shower and went back to work again. So yeah, no, I'd go, sometimes I'd just go weeks and hardly ever see the kids. They'd be at school or something. Yeah, no, well, there was people living in town that there was a whole shift, pretty much you never met, because you're either at work or whatever. You might meet them in the weekend of you know, socially, but there was people come through this town, you didn't know who they were, because while you're on shift work, you just never really saw them. Apart from the overlap at work, yes, you'd meet them there, but you'd never meet their families or anything.
The school used to get 30 new 5-year-olds every month. And when I told the education department, look, we will need 20 new teachers through this year, they just didn't know what it meant. You know, the education system, they had a system where about every September all the schools gave them an idea of what they'd want in January. In most cases it didn't change from year to year, but there Twizel turned up, and there was a workforce of 60 school teachers in the place that we had to house, either in the single men's quarters or in the housing for married people. So that was quite an exercise just in itself. The school started with about 6 second-hand houses. The headmaster was the first person to live in Twizel.
At the peak of the population era in Twizel, the collective roles of the primary school and the high school, the 2 kindergartens which existed at the time in Twizel, was well over 2,000. When we were under great strain from the point of view of having enough classrooms, we were also under considerable strain obtaining teachers, because staffing in secondary schools at that time was quite difficult, and getting people to come to Twizel was even more difficult, because it was not looked upon as being one of the prime places to live as it is now, despite the fact that it was still had the same beautiful mountains and things that exist now, but for some reason or other Hydro schools were thought to be difficult places to teach in, and lots of people didn't want to live in places like Twizel. Of course, those prejudices were built upon total ignorance rather than anything else.
My involvement in the retention of Twizel was through my position on the Twizel Community Board, and the Community Board had been very enthusiastically supporting Twizel being retained. And while that was initially directed at government and the Mackenzie District Council, it later became much more localised because government departments such as the NZED decided that they were going to house their staff at a Marama, and of course that didn't bode very well for any attempts to retain Twizel and have a viable township here. So we had to take on a fight both with the NZED, their union, the PSA, and the Waitaki District Council to try and prevent this establishment of a new village down at Marama to house workers who would have worked at Twizel.
At one stage it became national news really, and a television documentary team came into the town on one occasion to film the various factions. We were filmed in our house along with a number of other people with either the same or opposing views, and then that night the debate carried on in the RSA in Twizel, and it probably became a fairly unsavoury exhibition, but it certainly did show the strength of feeling amongst the two factions, and it probably wasn't a debate that we could be very proud of in hindsight, but nonetheless it allowed us to air our views.
And we could see that whatever happened, the town should stay, and all the infrastructure was here. It had everything, sewers and everything, and unfortunately out where Kevin Higgins did his subdivision, the Ministry Works were actually bulldozing the sewers and everything in, and it was only Kevin got onto them and said he wanted to buy that land off the council, which he did, and the roads were left in there. Otherwise, they'd all been pushed out and dumped.
That we felt that it was ideally located and that we could turn it into a tourist town. And I guess Aaron and I put our money where our mouth was, and we bought a facility here that belonged to the government and turned it into the High Country Holiday Lodge and the hotels, and we helped to create something that was that we're very proud of, and they're good assets for the town.
You had to find people that actually had a vision of the town staying and wanted to come here. A lot of people that bought originally were young families who could not afford the Wanakas and the Queenstowns or Akaroas, so they were able to afford a holiday home here. And a lot of grandparents bought holiday homes here because it was affordable for them to buy one that all the family could use.
Well, when we were building these schemes, the communities in the area, they all thought they ought to get a bit of something out of it. When Ben Moore was built and the lake came, they built the sailors' cutting boat harbour and also the one over at Halden. For Ben Moore, you had to go to the Ministry of Works to get approval to build sailors' cutting, for example. And then in the upper Waitaki, what do we do? And there was nothing planned. The community at large really felt they wanted something. And so I wrote to the rowers about it and said, would you be interested up here? And it took me 2 years to get anybody in the rowing circle interested. Anyhow, I got them down there in the South Island Rowing Committee. They came down to see me in July, and I took them down on the flats where Lake Ruatana is now and waved my arms round. We can do this and that, and the water will be up to there. There was a hoar frost on. Even the rabbits didn't move around. And they just wondered what the hell had gone wrong with me. All they knew was they wanted 2,000 metres of water, 6 foot deep and about 8 lanes wide, 40 feet it was then for width. And this was all done really just by modifying the earthworks that we were doing in the area. Included with the course was a rowing course building. We had no approval for that, but we built it, and the rowers, they ran a raffle for $100,000 they expected to get, and the first prize was $10,000. They only made about $11,000 out of the raffle. By that time the building was up for $100,000 and they had no money to pay for it. So that's where I got into trouble, was after the course was opened and everybody had seen it, the department gave me the option of retiring early or alternatively facing charges under the State Services Act for doing work I wasn't supposed to. When I've looked at it since, the people in head office, they did the right thing in dealing with me, but if I talk to them now, they more or less say this is great now. And I sort of lost the battle, but I won the war. And you've only got to look at the rowing now to see how they like it. It's one of the best, well, it is the best course in New Zealand, really. And they've improved it with more facilities and edging of the lake and all that sort of thing. And it's really become a great event, really.
Clear skies are usual over much of New Zealand. The Mackenzie Basin, which is free of ambient city light, offers fine views of the Milky Way and its neighboring galaxies. The Southern Cross, the Jewel Box, Coal Sack, and the Magellanic Clouds are the most recognizable constellations in the Southern Hemisphere. The farming community of Twizel has been and continues to be a major contributor to the economy of the area. The landscape of agriculture has been modified with the introduction of the hydro development, splitting up runs and making traditional sheep farming more challenging. But it has also provided new farming opportunities that have come to light only after the completion of the project, with large-scale irrigation and aquaculture.
The merino that we've been growing here on Bend Rose is some of the finest you'll find in the country. This last year we clipped some of the finest wool ever from this property, and it's all been brought about, I guess, by my love of the merino and what it produces. Lucky enough in the early days to have a very close relationship with our stud ram breeder, the late Robert Jopp of Murtry. Him and I used to go to various sheep shows and constructively pull sheep apart, and trying to understand why and what fors, and the relationship developed where we used to swap sheep of genetic value to one another. The climax of that was we established a small group of farmers, 10 of us. We screened over 100,000 odd ewes. We picked out 100 finest ones of those. We established a genetic base Benrose procures most of their rams from that source right now. The average of that flock is 14.3 microns. The Benrose flock this year, considerable amount of wool in that 14 micron bracket. We also have a quantity of 12.5 micron wool that's been produced from out in the paddock, challenging a lot of the housed merino sheep trying to replicate. It's the challenge of actually producing the best wool in the world. I've had great pleasure in what I've done over in the past.
The hydro-canal conditions, it's the quality of the water, it's highly oxygenated, it is not polluted, it operates within certain temperature parameters, and it suits the salmon produced. And those two salmon species were the sockeye salmon and the Pacific or king salmon, or chinook or quinnet. It's got about 4 different names. One of the characteristics, of course, of farming in the canal is the canal flows. And the canal flows are, I guess, the biggest advantage that aquaculture has here. There's 135,000 litres of water a second running through the farm. And you look at any other land-based farm and they're lucky if they can get a half a cubic of water to run through their farm. What we're basically doing is farming in a river that is confined within nice formed banks.
What we have here is some of the salmon that we're growing in the canal salmon farms. They're really beautiful fish, and nobody would have thought 20 years ago that we could grow these around Twizel in the hydro canals. But we're getting better at it every year. We're growing bigger and better fish, and they're beautiful to eat.
Well, the carrying, it's a benefit here, and I work in other countries with seawater farms with a lot of carrying, and the quality of the fish compared with probably not too much carrying waters were a lot better. All right, for the same reason I said before, you know, the fish is more active, produce more muscles instead of fat, and that's a good stuff and a good benefit in the market.
2,000 tonne, for instance, 1,000 each on the Tekapau and Ohau Canal. The employment that brings to Twizel, the services that brings, like in terms of freight companies that have to operate in and out of here, bringing in feed, taking out, a processing facility that was built by associates who worked for Mount Cook Salmon, you know, the development of the Benmore Salmon Farm, and so on and so on. All of this is actually coming to fruition right now, and that vision, their hope is to have this sort of 1,000 tonne on each canal within 5 years. That will return something like an annual income of between 60 and 100 million per annum. Now that is getting pretty much level with what Meridian generate, you know, for power. It's quite amazing. So what you look back and see is not only we're using the water for the benefit of the nation for power generation, but there's a dual use where aquaculture is fitting in and generating similar amounts of income. The benefit for Twizel, of course, is that Twizel is the hub. The farm staff work here. There are more staff currently employed now. It's probably the second or the biggest employer, aquaculture. While electricity employs a certain number of people within Meridian, there are other people who are employed as contractors who come and go, which is fine, but you know, just aquaculture is becoming a major employer. So if you look at the whole Mackenzie Basin and the history of it, to go from high country sheep stations to power generation for the nation to aquaculture is quite a step change, and it's occurring right now. And probably within 5 to 10 years, that vision of 3,500 tonne production, processing facility in Twizel, all of those things will have come to fruition, and probably an employment force of 100 people, 60 to 100 people. It's quite amazing.
The breed of cows we run up here are Hereford. Hereford are pretty thick-skinned and good doing cattle, quite hardy. With the long winters, it's good to have a breed like the Hereford. Short summers, long winter. The cows, they've got great ability to put on weight very quickly, and we're lucky we get a bit of northwest rain, west coast rain spilling off the main divide, so that hopefully keeps the grass lush most of the summer. It wouldn't be too much of a problem to go organic with the cattle. We couldn't do that at the moment because we put super on. You can buy organic super, but there's not enough incentive for us to go organic. That might change in the future. They might, the fattening farms down country might pay a better price for weaner calves in March, April. Early winter, the cows come in to be TB tested, and those replacement heifers, they're drafted off and we feed them separately. Depending on the winter, how much snow we get, how hard the frosts are, how much rain, we've got to feed them accordingly to get them. The grass doesn't, it's a long winter, the grass doesn't start growing until September. Middle, late September, and the cows start calving early October, so we've got to do a lot of monitoring and shifting them to make sure they get through the winter in good condition. This grass is growing this time of year, it's early November. It can dry out in December, January, so the calves go back towards the west coast on the main divide where the rainfall's higher. The cows and calves hunted up there with a horse. So they stay up there, we keep an eye on them. The bull goes out just before Christmas, so we've quite a bit of work involved making sure that the bull covers all the cows. We've got to hunt the bulls around and make sure that they haven't gone lame or something, because that's very important, otherwise you don't get many calves next year. A lot of farmers only leave the bull in for 2 cycles, which is only 40 or 50 days, but because it's a long way up the top of the valley, we leave the bull until March. We have a big day, 700 or 800 calves are marked in one day. There's quite a team of us. Start daylight in the morning and we get finished before it's too hot. But that's the full cycle till the next year. It carries on.
Dairying's always been quite dominant in the North Island. Probably the last 20 years it's taken off in the South Island. In the last 20 years it's really, the opportunities in the South Island for dairying have evolved. Yeah, I think South Island became the land of opportunity for dairying. Initially most people went to Southland, then perhaps South Canterbury, and then it spread into Canterbury with more and more irrigation. So it was the consistent and the settled climate and everything really suits dairying in the South Island. It was quite barren and but a big block of land out there, and I just thought with the water and the sunshine hours, I was told there's 400 hours more sunshine hours here than at the Oamaru airport, and I thought with water, sunshine and fertiliser, well, we could grow grass. So it just sort of evolved from there. I saw it as a challenge and decided to take it up. Ali and I came to Twizel in 1985, and we'd chosen Twizel to come and live because we had already bought some beehives around Twizel, and the decision had been made to keep Twizel as a town, and we saw it as a good place to set up a base. We continued to work our bees, and we were doing casual work as well, just trying to make extra money and get going in our beekeeping business. We were here in the early days and sort of almost like one of the new breed of people into Twizel who had nothing to do with the town. So beekeeping in the Mackenzie really started back in the late 50s. It was when farmers started oversowing and top dressing with clover and putting superphosphate on, and really that started to produce a lot of flowering clover, and beekeepers saw this and started bringing their hives up. So there was a number of old beekeeping names in South Canterbury who came up in those days, and they had to learn whether you could keep hives up here in the winter and that sort of thing. So there was Cloak's honey and Davidson's apiaries and Bartram's, and some found it was just too cold in some areas to keep the hives. So they soon figured out where you could keep them, but most of the beekeeping that was done in the basin was migratory beehives brought up for the summer clover flowering and then taken back away before the winter. So that's still a big part of beekeeping in the Mackenzie Basin. Yeah, our business has grown now to 2,000 hives. We're spread around the Mackenzie and down towards Merino, and we're producing over 100 tonne of honey a year, all good quality honey. If you want to be successful, it's all about doing things at the right time, trying to make sure they're looked after and properly. To learn beekeeping from
people who are commercial beekeepers, who know what they're doing, or else if you don't, and they'll die of starvation, they'll die of disease, all those things, and also you will not get good honey crops. At one stage we were offered a job, a farm manager's job down on the plains, and we went and looked at it. It was in our early days when we were still trying to pay off debt and get the business up and running, and a farming lifestyle sort of maybe, you know, for kids maybe thought it might suit us better. But come back through the Mackenzie and Mount Cook was just sticking out there along Pukaki as we drove home, and we just said to each other, well, we don't want to go down there, and we've been really happy here ever since, and just made a decision to stay here, and we had a good business and get stuck into it. Yeah, the other thing we really like about Twizel is the people, and their friendliness, and the way they look after each other. You know, there's no better town to be in if you have problems in life. It just astounds me how people rally around and help other people, and it's just a nice place to live.
Twizel is home to the country's finest rowing venue, biking and hiking trails throughout the basin, and world-class trout streams and rivers, and excellent skiing.
That hurt.
Good on you.
There, baby.
One of the distinctive birds of the area is the endangered kaki, or black stilt. Despite 20 years of intensive protection, this species remains the rarest wading bird in the world. Considered a national treasure by the Māori, it can only be found in New Zealand. It once had a range reaching as far north as Rotorua in the North Island and as far south as the wetlands of inland South Canterbury. Over the past 150 years, its habitat has steadily decreased with the draining of swamplands and increased human activities. New Zealand had no warm-blooded mammal predators until their human introduction. These introduced predators are now the main threat to the black stilt, destroying eggs, killing chicks and adult birds. In 1979, a program designed to help the black stilt regain a foothold was started, and now carries on through the Department of Conservation here in Twizel. Today, most of the breeding takes place in permanent side stream backwashes and swamplands on the edges of broad shingle-bed rivers. During stable river flows, their feeding takes place mid-river. But during flooding, the nearby streams and swamplands become crucial feeding areas for adults and chicks. Black stilts pass through a range of plumages for their first 15 months before attaining a full black plumage. They feed throughout the day and sometimes into the night, pecking, probing for a variety of aquatic insects, their nymphs and larvae. In particular, mayfly and caddis, which exist in abundance throughout the braided river systems in the area. Currently, the black stilt can only be found in 9 river valleys, from the Aoraki in the south to the Godley in the north. The highest mountain in New Zealand is Aoraki. This lofty mountain stands powerfully at a height of 3,754 meters, or 12,316 feet. The Tasman Glacier on the slopes of the mountain is the longest in New Zealand. At 27 kilometers long and 600 meters deep, it covers an area of more than 100 square kilometers. Recent retreats of the glacier due to global warming have formed a terminal lake that is rapidly increasing in size. The lake is populated by icebergs of every shape and size imaginable, created by the calving off of the terminal wall of the glacier. Although covered by snow on the upper reaches, the terminal area is rock-covered, carried down by the glacier and exposed by ablation along its course. Twizel is the nearest town to this World Heritage Site, which covers over 700 square kilometers. 40% of that area is covered by glaciers. Of New Zealand's 20 highest peaks, all but one, Mount Aspiring, lie within this park. A deep feeling of mystery and awe is commonly felt in the openness of the Mackenzie Basin. It has been described many times by many people, from the secret trout streams to the magic of a sunrise over the golden tussock before a morning muster, the relaxed encounter of a shepherd, fisherman, or a landowner, the awesome spectacle of the stars. Twizel has been fortunate to remain in the basin. It has and continues to provide an opportunity to live and work in this pristine environment.